Oh, okay. Okay, well, it's 7 o'clock, and as you know, we like to start on time. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Matt Binder. I am your adult program coordinator here at the Schaumburg Township District Library. Tonight, we have historian, author, and former Chicago cop Robert Girardi. Before we get started, I just want to clarify a few things. We are having our blood drive tomorrow from noon to 5. Versity Blood Clinics is coming out. They have a mobile trailer as usual. They'll park it in our central library parking lot. I know they're calling for Armageddon levels of snow tomorrow, but hospitals need blood. So if you are able to make it safely to the library to donate blood, please do. They will reward you with a great pair of socks. And who doesn't want to have socks they can brag about? Also, all of our February programs from the 1st through the 22nd have been moved virtually. If you have any questions about that, please contact me or reach out to anyone at the library to contact me. We do still plan on having our February 24th Brit Bennett event in person. So if you have tickets for that, unless something changes, we're still doing that in person. But we're going to do it as safely as we can, which has been the refrain we've been saying to each other for about 3 years now. Anyway, I think that's enough for me. I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak to you tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before I launch into the program. I'm Robert Girardi. I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Chicago. Never lived anywhere but in the confines of the city. Right now, I'm speaking to you from the environs of O'Hare Airport, but in the city. I'm a Civil War historian, which is usually what I talk about. I'm the author of a number of books on the Civil War, and I travel all over the country to speak about topics in that realm. But this is a topic that unites my personal history a little bit with the history of the city of Chicago. I've spent 31 years, I'm now retired, but 31 years as a Chicago police officer, 25 of those as a homicide detective in the worst neighborhoods of the city of Chicago, Al Capone land for the Chicago part of his career before he went to Cicero. I spent 30 years working the midnight shift. And so speaking about a blood drive, I've been accused of being a vampire. So the more blood you give, the better I like it. We're going to get in tonight to talking about the notorious Al Capone and his legacy and how it has affected Chicago and just our perception of some things. But I'm not a fan. So if you're looking for a rah-rah Al Capone talk, this is the wrong place to be. There's nothing new about crime. Every big city in the world has suffered from this plague of violence and subterfuge from the beginning of time. The first family couldn't even survive. Cain killed his brother Abel. So there's been murder and mayhem since the beginning of time, depending on how far back you want to go. No society is exempt from having a subset of individuals who would rather take than earn, kill or destroy rather than create, and control rather than contribute. Money, power, and greed. These are the commandments of the criminal element. Now, this screenshot here is from a website called HeyJackass.com, which is a real-time computation of Chicago's murder and what they call the shot clock, where at least a person is shot every 12 hours or a person is killed every 12 hours in Chicago and shot every couple of hours. So far, these are the stats as of today for this year. So we've already had 49 people killed this year and well over 200 shot. And it doesn't matter. Nobody notices. Every single day in the news, the reports of violence in the city, not just Chicago, but every big city, permeates the news. Shootings, stabbings, murders, robberies. Most of the names of the victims and the offenders whiz past our ears. We hear the names, if we even hear the name, and then we immediately forget them because they don't matter, because there's a soundbite coming down the pike that's going to replace the relevance of what we just heard. Every year, there's hundreds of murders, thousands of shootings, and nothing ever seems to be done about it. And even worse is that general apathy. Nobody cares unless, for some reason, usually political, or there's a glamour shot. Nobody cares about a particular victim unless it's sexy for news purposes. Otherwise, it's apathy. Apathy rules. And I used to tell my partner at work, never underestimate the power of apathy. Chicago has a notorious reputation for violence and for apathy relative to that violence, with casualties that stagger the imagination, because we lose more people on an annual basis in Chicago due to death by gunshot than get killed in our nation's wars, especially modern wars. More Chicagoans die than soldiers fall in faraway battles. Lately, the city has, Chicago in particular, and other big cities are renowned for the amount of violence that is occurring. But until the last couple of years, the murder rate in Chicago was really at an all-time 20-year low. We've only since caught up to that. But the perception has always been there that Chicago is this most violent city. It's nothing new. The city has a culture of violence and celebrates it because the reputation is glamorous. Strangers to the city know one name more than any other: Al Capone. Chicago is a world-class city. People come here from all over the world to enjoy the many opportunities for business, entertainment, history, and culture. But this notorious gangster, Al Capone, has tarnished Chicago since the days of Prohibition, so for 100 years. His crimes, his consolidation of organized crime, and his reputation have cast a shadow over the city and its legacy. It's a shadow that stains our city. It's a dark, dirty shadow. It's a giant shadow that may never be erased. The very name of Al Capone conjures up images of gangsters, prohibition, and murder. The name also conjures up a morbid fascination for this character. He's the greatest symbol of the criminal empire during the Prohibition era. Capone's name is synonymous with murder. Well, who is he? Who is Al Capone? Alphonse Gabriel Capone, born January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents had emigrated to the United States in 1894, and he was their third child. That's number 3 out of 9. Capone grew up in the Five Points neighborhood of the city. The Five Points is the notorious area of New York that all the prominent gangsters emanate from. Capone, as a child, was bright but rebellious. That's a surprise. He was expelled from school when he was 14 years old. And so he joined the local street gangs. Much of what is what's happening today with kids out of school. They join gangs because it's something to do. Well, Capone joined 2 different gangs, the Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors, 2 notorious street gangs in that neighborhood. And he got involved with low level of organized crime, serving as a tough. So that means he was the muscle. If somebody wasn't doing what you wanted, you called on Al Capone and his little buddies, and they would go and put a beating on you. Between scams, all little gangsters and gangbangers are involved in some kind of a scam where they want to get something for nothing. He had some legitimate jobs. He worked as a clerk in a candy store, a pin boy for a while in a bowling alley, and he was a cutter in a bookbindery. So some legitimate trades before he joined the notorious 5 Points gang. And then his criminal career began in earnest. Thereafter, he worked as a bouncer for New York mobster Frankie Yale. We'll hear more about him at the Harvard Inn in Brooklyn, New York. And it was in this capacity that his face was slashed giving him the notorious nickname of Scarface. It seemed that Al Capone admired some pretty woman, and he made a comment about a portion of her anatomy, her posterior. Her brother overheard it, took offense, and slashed his face with a knife. And so Al Capone earned his nickname Scarface. And it was quite an injury at the time. In 1918, Al Capone met and married his wife, an Irish girl, Mary or May Coughlin. He met her at a local dance, and they quickly hit it off, got married, and soon had a son whom they named Albert, Sonny nickname, Francis Capone. Al Capone did not stay out of trouble in these days. His first arrest was on a charge of disorderly conduct while working as Frankie Yale's bouncer. In 1919, he also was implicated. That's police jargon for he was suspected, but there was never enough evidence to do anything about it. 2 different murders while he was working as an underling for Frankie Yale. But since no witnesses were willing to come forward, he was never charged and never went to trial. But to cool off the negative implications of being accused of a double murder, imagine that, Frankie Yale sent Al Capone to Chicago until things would cool off in New York. And he moved his family into a house on the south side of Chicago at 7244 South Prairie Avenue. The house still stands. And there's a picture on the right of his wife, May. Well, Capone needed a job, so he went to work for Chicago mobster Donato Torrio, Johnny, nicknamed the Fox. Torrio would be a mentor for Al Capone. He was managing underboss for Chicago's big mobster, Big Jim Colossimo, or Colossimo. Torrio was nicknamed the Fox for his, he had an analytical mind, and he would be able to see how to organize things and make crime more profitable. Imagine that. I have a feeling that people wouldn't engage in crime if it didn't pay on some level. Torrio was credited with organizing Chicago's mob into an efficient business-like organization. According to some, he was a criminal mastermind. Why, these bad guys are always criminal masterminds. They're not just high-level thugs. Somehow we always have to attribute some higher power to them, like a Marvel cartoon character. But they were bad enough without superpowers. This is Big Jim Colossimo. Born in Italy, he came to Chicago at age 17. He quickly got involved in criminal activity, and he was a bagman for some of Chicago's first ward aldermen. Some things never change, especially in Chicago. So Hinky Dink McKenna and John Coughlin, 2 of the most notorious corrupt Chicago aldermen of that era, hired Colossimo to be their bagman. And he became quite good at it. He paid off local politicians, police, to my shame, and judges, and thus he had a free hand in his own criminal endeavors. Colossimo married a Chicago madam, proprietress of a whorehouse, and he was soon overseeing an empire built on prostitution, gambling, and nightclubs. The sin industry made money for the mob, and it allowed him to adorn himself with gold, diamonds, and other jewelry, and he earned the nickname of Diamond Jim. When Colossimo and Torrio opened a brothel in 1919, located at 2222 South Wabash Avenue in Chicago, called the Four Deuces for obvious reasons, Torrio brought in Al Capone to be a bouncer and a bartender, something that Capone met his skill set. When Prohibition became the law of the land with the passage of the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the era of the gangster was really born, especially in Chicago. Selling bootleg alcohol quickly replaced prostitution and gambling as the lucrative industries of the crime world. The beginning of an era of lawlessness, corruption, and murder had begun. And we have all seen the movies and the Untouchables and all the signs of the speakeasies and people spending money hand over fist, and the power struggles that ensue for control of the trade. The working men and women who defied the laws to get a drink and to patronize the speakeasies and the establishments that were applying illegal alcohol never seemed to understand that every shot that they took from a glass was the result of numerous shots of a more lethal variety that occurred on the streets. And the same thing is true in today's dope trade, where people who don't see the harm in using drugs in a recreational manner never seem to understand the implications of the street violence that makes acquiring it so easily possible. Every shot you take from a needle, there are several dead bodies on the street that have contributed to it. This is Al Capone's world. This is the life he chose. He worked as the bouncer and bartender in Big Jim's brothel. Also at the time, he, despite his matrimonial vows, decided that he would sample some of the favors of the working girls in the brothel, and he contracted syphilis during this period, for which he never received any treatment, and which ultimately he'll pay a price for. I've never seen any reference to how his wife felt about this unexpected gift that he brought home with him. Torrio and Colossimo had fundamental disagreements, though, over whether or not to get involved in the bootlegging trade. Torrio was a vocal proponent based on the huge profitability of the illegal alcohol. He was the businessman, remember, the fox. Colossimo was a feel-good guy. He wanted to keep it clean with just the regular sin taxes of prostitution and gambling. And so the two were going to have a falling out. But Torrio had secretly bought up a number of breweries, anticipating being able to convince Colossimo to go into the bootlegging trade. It was time for one of them to go. And on May 11th, 1920, Big Jim Colossimo was murdered in the front foyer of his cafe. That's his body laying there on the floor. Nobody was ever identified as being the shooter. But Torrio inherited Colossimo's criminal empire. There is reason to believe that Torrio had called in his friend Frankie Yale from New York to do the dirty deed. But rumors also implicated Al Capone. So it's not really sure, but Capone was involved in the takeover. But unfortunately, just like happened in my career and still today, nobody would step forward because nobody knew anything, saw anything, or heard anything that would allow the police to take some action in furtherance of identifying the perpetrator of this murder. Torrio took Al Capone under his wing and groomed him to be his top lieutenant. He made sure that Al Capone got an education, and he worked to polish up his speech and his personal appearance. He also learned, Capone did, how to manage the criminal empire. So he was an active student under Torrio to learn how to make criminal activity a profitable enterprise. His success and his status brought with it a taste for the finer things in life. And so Al Capone quickly became a clothes horse and a stylista. He took pride in wearing flashy suits, fancy hats, pinky rings, and silk underwear. I don't know who he thought was going to see that, but that was one of the things he liked. And he also liked to be called by the nickname Snorky, which, excuse me, is not very frightening, but it's a term at the time that meant stylish. I'm not sure what it means now. Capone hated the nickname Scarface, and he did his best to make sure that that was never mentioned in his presence. But Capone established a reputation for both generosity and helpfulness. If he wanted to look after you, he did, and he made sure you were comfortable. He loved drinking, womanizing, and gambling. Those were his three reasons for being. Working from the Four Deuces, and here's a picture in real time and in modern time of the Four Deuces at 2222 South Wabash. Excuse me. Torrio and the other mobsters in Chicago decided that the most equitable way to engage in profit sharing was to divide up the territory. So divide into geographic districts, and each person would reap the benefits of their own district. Hopefully, this would minimize rivalry and conflict. Bootlegging was organized and distribution networks were established. So I had my clientele, you had your clientele, and the third guy had his. And as long as we stayed out of each other's way, we all made money. Today's dope gangs operate on the same principle. As long as we're all making money, it's all good. But if we cross the street and invade somebody else's territory, somebody got to die. And that was as true then as it is now. Merchants were expected to buy from the local lord or pay the consequences. So if you've seen the movie The Untouchables, in the opening scene where you don't want to buy the inferior product that I'm offering because my competitor has got something better, but he's coming into my territory, you shouldn't ought to do that because something bad's going to happen to you or your business. Like you might get killed and your building might blow up. That's very real. Bootlegging was profitable, not just for the gangsters, but it was also profitable for the workers. It employed truckers, mechanics, brewers, politicians, and the police. And the police and the politicians were paid to look the other way and ignore the illegality that was permeating the city. And it got to be so notorious that on one occasion in 1922, when Al Capone was overserved and crashed his car on the street, he pulled a gun on policemen when they arrived. He was taken into custody, but as he braggingly told the police, they could never make the charges stick. He would fix them, and he did. And that's what you need to know about law and order in the Prohibition era. The following year, 1923, the truce between these factions in Chicago broke down. Between September and December of that year, an all-out war erupted in Chicago. More than 700 people were murdered in Chicago during the Prohibition Wars. That number's small by today's standards. But in Chicago, Capone was the enforcer for Torrio, and he took control over the war. So he called the shots that resulted in many of those murders, whether personally or as the man pushing the button. As a response, unlike today, as a response to the crime, Chicago elected a reformist mayor, William Deaver, in 1923. And he started to put the heat on to the illegal activities. And so Capone and some of the other mobsters moved their business out of the confines of the city of Chicago into suburban Cicero, and they took over that city. And according to some sources, have never let go. Capone was able to rig the local elections, believe it or not, that happened back then, and opened up a number of clubs and brothels in Cicero. So he just diversified and moved, expanded his empire. He headquartered out of the Hawthorne Inn, which was located at 4823 West 22nd Street, so just west of Cicero Avenue on Cermak in Cicero. And during his tenure in Cicero, Capone opened up or controlled 161 gambling and liquor establishments just in the town of Cicero. That's unbelievable. Between 1920 and 24, Capone took over street operations that allowed Torrio to organize the business end of bootlegging. Capone was not shy about using the tools of the trade to eliminate any competition. He seemed to be made of Teflon, however, because no matter how many times he would be stopped or questioned by the police, there was never enough evidence to make anything stick to him. Meantime, Torrio expanded the business as well as influence peddling, which means he was buying more politicians, more policemen, more judges to solidify his criminal empire. Everything, this was like a criminal paradise until there's trouble in paradise, which always happens when you get a bunch of gangsters together. Somebody always wants to outdo the other guy. And that's what happened with Johnny Torrio. His main rival, Dale O'Banion, decided to get rid of the competition. He wanted to be the overlord. O'Banion, who was one of Torrio's partners, decided to dupe Torrio into buying one of his breweries. O'Banion ran a number of breweries. And when he set up Torrio to buy a brewery and come check it out, the place was raided by the police. Torrio got arrested and he was put in jail. And because of a fallout from that, the Torrio Capone empire suffered severe financial losses, as well as the $500,000 cash that Torrio had handed over to O'Banion for the purchase of some of these breweries. In retaliation, Frankie Yale, the outsider from New York, came back to Chicago. On November 10th, 1924, Yale and two of his accomplices gunned down Dale O'Banion at his flower shop on the north side of Chicago. Torrio decided to retire after an unsuccessful attempt on his life, and so there was an immediate retaliation. Torrio decided it was time to go to the Riviera and turned over his criminal empire to Al Capone. Now, what role Capone had in some of these dealings, we don't really know. We do know is that soon Al Capone was running the show. And he loved being on top. Nothing appealed more to Al Capone than to be the guy calling the shots. And he flaunted that image, his power and his money. He liked to flash cash, diamonds, jewelry. He liked publicity, and he liked to hold press conferences to deny the multiple allegations of criminal activity that were being made against him. But like a lot of today's notorious corrupt people, he just fluffed it off and bragged about it, and he got away with it for the most part. Part of the reason he got away with it was because, in spite of the flash, he was cautious. He bought this custom Cadillac that you see on the screen there, and he had it armored for his protection. And he had several different headquarters with interlocking tunnels and ways to escape to get out of them so that you could never really corner him. He also began systematically eliminating all of his rivals. In 1926, he personally led a 5-car assault on his rivals in the city of Cicero. In an epic shootout, 3 people were killed, and wounded was a Cook County state's attorney, which even then was a no-no. You shouldn't shoot a state's attorney. It looks bad, especially for corrupt state's attorneys. Capone fled to Michigan, but he surrendered himself after a few months. He was never charged in any of the shootings. George Bugs Moran, who's pictured here on the upper left, real name Adelard Kunin, took over for O'Banion. So after the murder of O'Banion, his successor was Moran. Jaime Weiss, who was one of Moran's top lieutenants, organized an attempt to put a hit on Al Capone while he was seated in a coffee shop at the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero. And despite a spectacular number of shots fired, hundreds of shots were fired at Al Capone as he sat in the coffee shop, Capone survived. Not surprisingly, as you see on the lower left, Jaime Weiss was found murdered shortly after the missed attempt on Al Capone's life. In July 21st of 1928, Capone, outreaching for even more power, ordered a hit on his friend Frankie Yale when he learned that Yale was skimming money from him. So Yale was on Capone's payroll, longtime friend and mentor, but he was dipping his fingers into the candy jar, and Capone had no qualms about having him murdered. Frankie Yale is reputedly the first person killed with a machine gun during during this era. After all of this violence, the murders and the attempt murders, Capone decided that it was time to lay low for a while. So he moved down to his Florida estate in this little conservative 14-room mansion. And it was during his time that he spent here that he started planning the overthrow of Bugs Moran and his final takeover of power in Chicago. Moran was his biggest rival and was cutting into the criminal profits. Clearly, he had to go. And so at this time, Al Capone was making about $100 million a year from his speakeasies, bookie joints, gambling houses, racetracks, whorehouses, distilleries, and breweries. That's an unfathomable amount of money, but it wasn't enough for Big Al Capone. Chicago's mayor during this era, Big Bill Thompson, was apparently content to look the other way as Capone ran this multi-million-dollar criminal empire. Well, everybody has heard of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and this was Capone's big shot at trying to take over the entire criminal enterprise in Chicago. So February 14th, 1929, 7 members of Moran's gang were lined up against a wall in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street and shot by men who were dressed in the uniforms of Chicago police officers. Now, excuse me, Moran was meant to be one of the targets of this raid, but he was late. And when he arrived at a nearby coffee shop and saw the police roll up, he decided discretion was the better part of valor, and he didn't go to see what was happening. Lucky for him. Al Capone, at the time of the massacre, was at his estate in Florida, conveniently on the phone with the state's attorney. What better alibi than that when a multiple murder that you ordered is going on? Now, of the 7 people shot, 6 of them were dead on scene. One of them survived long enough to go to the hospital. And when real Chicago police detectives went to interview the survivor and asked him who shot him, he responded with an answer that I heard many, many times in my own career: nobody shot me. And so that person died without identifying the culprits, and nobody was ever charged with murder for the St. Valentine's Day massacres, although a number of people were suspected. John Scalise and Albert and Salmi, you see their pictures, they look like friendly guys. You invite them to your cocktail party. They were suspected of being involved in the massacre, but there was never enough evidence brought forward to bring them in or charge them. Now, they had illusions of grandeur themselves, and they decided that they would undermine Al Capone. But like he usually did, Big Al found out about their plots. And both of them were savagely beaten to death with baseball bats, and then they were shot. Capone was suspected in their murders, and he was even declared public enemy #1. He had a $50,000 contract put out on his life by his rivals. And to escape the heat and to put himself out of harm's way, he orchestrated his own arrest in the city of Philadelphia, believing that he would be safer in jail than out on the street. But even he couldn't grease the wheels completely, and he ended up spending more than a year in jail, something he had not anticipated. While inside, some of his associates were brought under investigation, charged, and convicted of income tax evasion, something he would learn more about in the future. When Capone got out of jail, he tried to redeem his reputation with the public. During the early years of the Depression, Al Capone operated a number of soup kitchens for those in need on the south side of Chicago, in the old Bridgeport area. And even during my own career, it wasn't unusual excuse me, to find an old timer who remembered going to one of these soup kitchens to get fed. So Al Capone was a hero, a mentor to some of these people. He also did some things that had long lasting beneficial effects, such as regulating the quality of milk and milk deliveries, bringing much needed improvements to both. So he was involved in the early stages of homogenizing and pasteurizing the milk that was being delivered on Chicago streets. And these are all good things. And I'm sure the people that he fed from the soup kitchens were happy to get a warm meal. But the one thing that Al Capone did was, or rather, the one thing he didn't do was stop killing people. He was notorious. It was one of these people that everybody knew was involved in criminal behavior, but it seemed to be glamorous to cozy up to him. Pictured here at an exhibition game between the Chicago White Sox and the Chicago Cubs on September 9th, 1931. This is Chicago Cubs catcher Gabby Hartnett signing an autograph for Al Capone's son. Now, this picture made headlines, and it was so controversial that the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, sent a telegram to Hartnett telling him that this was bad for baseball and telling him that he should not pose with Al Capone again because of the negative implications in bringing defamation on the sport of baseball. And Hartnett responded to Kennesaw Mountain Landis with his own telegram in which he said, okay, but if you don't want me to take my picture with Al Capone, you tell him. Capone was finally taken down by IRS agents. Some of his ledgers for his criminal enterprises were secured, and a lot of his illicit income was documented in these ledgers in minute detail. Ultimately, Capone was indicted on 24 counts of income tax evasion. His attempt to fix the trial was thwarted when the judge at the trial made a last-minute substitution of juries, and instead of the bought jury, Capone's trial was held in front of an unbesmirched jury, and he was convicted on these counts and sentenced to a period of 11 years in a federal penitentiary. Additionally, he was fined $50,000 in order to pay $30,000 in court costs, in what many would call chump change, considering his $100 million plus criminal enterprise. Capone originally started serving his sentence in the city of Atlanta on May 4th, 1932. However, he soon exerted his influence even in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. He smuggled in cash and he bought special treatment from the guards. His cell was carpeted. He decorated his cell with carpeting and special furnishings. He had cigars and the use of a typewriter. The guards used to sit in the cell with him to listen to the radio serials that were on at the time. And he had multiple visits from friends and family, sometimes on a daily basis. It was like being in a country club. He spent about 2 years in Atlanta before officials had enough of this soft peddling of the penal system, and they sent him to Alcatraz in August of 1934. Here's a picture of Al Capone's cell in the center there in Alcatraz. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's worth going because of the history of Alcatraz, not just because of the prison there, which was only a small part of its long history. At Alcatraz, Capone's party ended. The warden there was not the same man as ran the place in Atlanta. He did not give Capone any special privileges. Because of that, his status quickly fell among the other inmates, who, now that he was one of them, treated him like he was less than one of them. And so he had some not so pleasant times. One of the fellow inmates stabbed him, with a pair of shearing scissors. And Capone ended up spending more than one occasion in solitary confinement. In total, he would live at Alcatraz for 4.5 years until the debilitating effects of the syphilis he had contracted years earlier caught up with him. And he spent the remainder of his incarceration in a prison infirmary. He was released from Alcatraz in November of 1939, and he went back to Florida, where he lived in seclusion until his death on January 25th of 1947. And he was buried, surprisingly, he was allowed a Catholic burial in the cemetery, Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, not far from Cicero and just a few miles south from where I'm sitting. Capone's death was a media event. He even made the cover of Time magazine as their man of the year. Everybody wanted to celebrate this notorious gangster murdering thug. Since his death, his name and his image have become big business. Try to go anywhere or see any kind of gangster related topic and not be exposed to some manifestation of Al Capone, whether it's his imagery in cartoon character or quoting him as if he was some savant of the time. These are words of wisdom like Confucius. You see some of these quotes. I don't even know what street Canada is on. Ha ha ha. I'm like any other man. All I do is supply a demand. And there's the classic criminal justification of criminal activity. I'm just giving to people what they want. And if I make a profit, okay. And then, of course, the one everybody likes to chuckle at, unless you're a policeman, you can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. And we're supposed to think that this makes him some wise man who is quote worthy. Now, I have a little bit different agreement, but I'm biased. I admit it. Here's another one of his quotes where he's bragging about what will happen if you cross him. But none of that and none of the implications of that really seem to have a lasting effect on his reputation. There's something, for whatever reason, that captures popular culture's imagination with somebody who's so bad, so notorious, so lethal, and so smug about it that it becomes something you want to emulate, celebrate, glamorize, or at least make a profit from, as many places do. So you can go to Capone's for dinner and a show. And what could be more glamorous than taking your date out to go have a little celebratory function at the behest of a notorious gangster? At Alcatraz prison, his cell is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the place. And at their shop, you can buy souvenirs. You can buy all sorts of paraphernalia. Al Capone sweets. How about a bobblehead Al Capone? The only good thing about that is it's not firing shots. And then, of course, books for your kids. Al Capone does my homework. Well, you can imagine what kind of, I don't think too many valedictorians are coming out of that school if that's what they're looking for. But that's just the way that things are. Now, even his criminal empire and his career is celebrated. Now, if you look at this brochure, Chicago Crime Tours, it's a legit crime tour. You can go in the footsteps of Al Capone and John Dillinger, and you can follow in their footsteps and retrace their great deeds. Funny thing about this particular brochure, when you go into a hotel in Chicago, there's usually, in any big city, has a little bookshelf or rack with brochures of things to do and see while you're in town. And this is in some of the hotels in Chicago. This particular brochure was in the rack in the hotel at McCormick Place in Chicago. And I was called to McCormick Place in the early morning hours to investigate a gang shootout in the lobby of the hotel that resulted in a murder. And while I was there conducting my investigation of the murder, I happened to look at the rack and saw this brochure. And I just had to take one of these brochures because it was just such a notorious coincidence and such a despicable thing to find at a crime scene for a real murder, to see brochures glamorizing other real murders that happened ago. But this is our culture. And Hollywood and television have immortalized this man in multiple movies and TV shows. Even an episode of Star Trek glamorized Prohibition era gangsters, where Kirk and Spock are emulating gangsters to beat a local mob and bring peace to the planet. But many actors from Hollywood, from Robert De Niro on down, have portrayed Al Capone, and Rod Steiger in the movie Al Capone, which was just on recently, and of course the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, another glamorization of these events, although it's done in documentary style. Here's Capone's house at 7244 South Prairie. Several years ago, this sold, and it was big news because somebody bought the house where Al Capone used to sleep. Why you'd want to live? I mean, if you need a house, I guess it's as good as any, but I wouldn't buy it for that reason, especially not if you were paying premium rates to hang your hat where this man hung his at one time. Of course, the soup kitchens and the doing good established for Al Capone the reputation somewhat of a latter-day Robin Hood. The people that he helped out, the people he fed, you can't say anything bad about the man to them. The people he killed might have a different opinion, but most people don't ask them or consider what they do. It's easier to look the other way and find the good than to concentrate strictly on the bad. Some modern gangsters took a page out of Capone's book. John Gotti on the right was notorious as the Teflon Don modern day. He came the closest to being what Capone was, although he was nowhere near as successful. And then, of course, public enemy number one, El Chapo, recently taken into custody, was another modern day manifestation of Al Capone, somebody who wanted that power and that criminal empire to make good on what they were. And it continues. I even was able to stand in a lineup next to Al Capone in a Prohibition era exhibit in the State Historical Museum in Austin, Texas, a few years ago. And it's just fun to do. Go stand a lineup with Al Capone. And even I was silly enough to do that. But I did it for this purpose, not out of any respect for the man or his legacy. So here's the many faces of Al Capone. You see him smiling, you see him grinning, you see him smug, you see the scar that gave him his nickname. But there's only one truth behind the many faces. And where did I go? The real Al Capone is this. This is what the man was all about. This is what he stood for. This is how he should be remembered and not celebrated. Thank you.
All right, Robert, thank you so much. If you have questions, please put them in the chat in the Q&A. We've got a few waiting for you, Robert, so let's get started here. All right. This is from Alex. I have heard that Al Capone would dump bodies at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Chicago's southwest suburbs. Have you ever found this information in your research?
Well, I don't know that he did it. there were so many bodies that it's not unlikely Bachelor's Grove was a dumping ground. I mean, it's got a notorious reputation now as like one of Chicagoland's haunted cemeteries or whatever. But there were bodies dumped all over the place. Some of them just left on the street. So, but specifically linking that to Al Capone, I don't know that to be true or not true. I can't answer that.
All right. Olga would like to know what happened to Al Capone's money and his son.
I'm not sure. I didn't follow to see what happened to his son. Much of his money was confiscated. The feds will do that. You don't want to cross the IRS then or now, apparently. But I don't think anybody in his family was ever hurting. He had enough laundered money and money hid away, that mansion in Florida and other things. You see the size of his tombstone in the cemetery. But I think a lot of that money was confiscated. I don't know that for a fact or how much that would be, but I never heard of his widow or children being put on poverty row. He was too smart for that. No. Regardless of, and I know none of it was in the vault that Geraldo Rivera found 20 something years ago in that bozo circus, but it wasn't there, so it went somewhere.
PB would like to know, in the Chicago Police Department, was a single detective or team of detectives dedicated to working Al Capone cases? And there's a second question, but I'll let you ask.
Okay. Well, first of all, any homicide is going to get at least a pair of detectives to work on it. Then the same as now, sometimes more, sometimes less. Again, the criminal element and the notoriety that Capone had was something that I dealt with the legacy of that in my own investigations, where if you got a dope dealer or a gangbanger high level that gets gunned down, very few people are willing to come forward and give evidence. And so no matter, everybody knows, that's what I wrote here, everybody knows that so-and-so did it. Well, that doesn't do me as a detective any good. I need somebody to stand up and say, no, I saw this happen and this is how it happened. And Capone knew that nobody was going to stand up to him. And not only that, but unfortunately, the police department was very corrupt back then, and so were the judges and the politicians. And so even if he did stand up to some scrutiny, he can make it go away in court. And that's why his conviction on a federal level, because when the feds came in, they were looking at him and that would supersede what the local jurisdiction would do. So when the FBI gets involved in Chicago cases, the Chicago police are pretty much onlookers. Same was true then.
And then their second question was, does CPD keep a collection of items from popular names like Al Capone?
Actually, I'm not sure if it's still on display, but in the old crime lab, when Leventon State was police headquarters and you would go up to the crime lab, they had their wall of shame. And some of the items on display there would be, for example, the pistol that was recovered from John Dillinger's body and some things of that nature. So it's not really accessible to the public on any great level. But years ago, there was some archival, and there was a police museum on South State Street for many years where some of these kinds of things were kept. Most of it is, if it's no longer evidence, it goes away. But for these notorious things, yeah, some of them are kept. I mean, you even had some guy who bought 2122 North Clark Street, bought the garage wall, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre wall, and had it, I think it's in Arizona now in somebody's house or in the garage. Why in the world you'd want that is beyond me, but some people need hobbies, I guess.
I guess so.
So you never know.
You never know. Bettina would like to know, did he have any more children?
I don't know if there was more than one, although I don't think his wife was very affectionate after he brought her home the gift that keeps on giving. that ultimately led to his demise. So put yourself in that poor woman's shoes, and maybe that would be self-explanatory. I don't know a better way to say that.
Carol would like to know, how much education did Al Capone have?
Well, he dropped out of school at age 14. So what would we call it? Freshman, 8th grade, freshman in high school. He was such a thug in school. He was always getting in trouble that they just expelled him. And then he got a street education. It was under Johnny Torrio's tutelage that he actually got skilled in some of the areas where he would need to be a successful businessman. So formal education, very little. Informal education that led to him being competent, most competent ever in terms of running a criminal enterprise. He got a lot, and that was on the job training. But he didn't have a college degree or anything like that, and he was never valedictorian.
Olga would like to know, did he kill any women or children?
Well, there's a lot of what they call collateral damage, right? I mean, during his heyday, they're saying more than 700 murders. Then, as now, thugs who go out with a gun and spray the street with bullets are not very accurate in target selection. So they weren't using laser sights. So I don't have statistics on that. I didn't think to look into that, although it would be interesting. But I'm sure that a large percentage of those people who actually fell to gunfire were innocent, unintended victims, especially when you got arson and bombings into the mix.
Absolutely. Now, Robert, we've established that your primary interest is the Civil War. But if you were to research another gangster, who would it be?
Well, there is not that there's any in-depth type of knowledge to learn from them, but just even in the city of Chicago, the gangster disciples and their leaders, the Jeff Forts and the people of that nature who created these vast criminal empires that have kept me working overtime for all of my career with the murder and the mayhem on the streets of Chicago, and their ilk, the rise of the street gangs in Chicago, would probably be a compelling story that nobody would want to read. Problem is, again, then is now, like the people who worshipped Capone because he fed them during the Depression and he sanitized the milk and he gave them hot food. And so you can't really say anything bad about him. The same is true with a lot of these, I hate to say it, but the grandmas and the aunties and the little children of these dope dealing gangbangers in Chicago who they're flashing cash and they're buying grandma a widescreen TV and getting her a new car that she can go to the store in, and they don't want to know where the money comes from, and they don't want to stop. They don't want to kill the golden goose either, and so they don't cooperate. So it's hard to get the real story. I always thought it would be interesting to see how many people were murdered just in the Chicago housing projects from the date they went up till the day the last one came down. That number would be astronomical. It would be a small city's population.
Kathy would like to know, who took over Capone's criminal empire?
Well, Capone went down. A lot of his minions took over in Chicago. So you had Giancana and that ilk. They were all lieutenants of Capone, and up until the 70s and 80s, they continued on in a different form. They were not as vocal or flashy as he was, but it was business as usual. It was just a different captain of the ship. Sam Giancana, all of those guys, and it's only recently, like in our lifetimes, in the last 25 years, where the last shreds of them have gone away and diversified. Now it's a lot of it's laundered out, or there's other other industries taking over that now the muscle and the gangland shootings of the Capone era have gone away, but you still have street corner shootings. Just watch the news. We had 846 murders in Chicago last year. Most of them were not domestic disturbances.
Peter and or Sharon would like to know, did Al Capone only have the one wife?
Yes. Yeah, I think he was too notorious of a playboy. I'm not sure where his wife was during his waning years. I don't know if she was attending to him. I somehow doubt it. I didn't look into that in any kind of detail. But yeah, I think once, well, some of us have been married more than once, but once is enough for most guys.
They would also like to know.
My wife's not listening, so I'm safe.
Did you ever visit the Al Capone Chicago exhibit on the near north side before the city closed it down years ago?
No.
No.
I said the one concession that I made to the popular culture, and I did it to make the point for this talk, was to stand in that lineup. He's not somebody I want to honor.
And then Eileen would like to ask, what was the Purple Gang involved in the Valentine's Day Massacre?
That reference I don't know. I know it was Capone's people were primarily suspected and implicated, and it was Bugs Moran's group that got hit. I'm sorry, I don't know that reference. Maybe she could share something. Tell me about it. I don't know.
Hey. Were there gun laws in Capone's day to limit anyone from buying a gun?
Not like today. I mean, but most people didn't have a need for a gun. There's always been gun laws to restrict, but that's just to register. I mean, if you think about it, at the beginning of the Capone era, even the FBI agents were not armed, and it was only in response to the extreme violence of some of these notorious gangsters like Dillinger and Al Capone, and where the feds needed to be able to answer fire with fire. Chicago police were pretty much always armed, but the number of shootings and street shootings in Chicago, there's always somebody with a gun that's going to rob you or whatever, but it was not the kind of problem that it is today, regardless of laws. I mean, the laws reflect, hopefully, they reflect a real-time problem. That never seems to be the case in Chicago.
Carol would like to know, was Capone born in Italy, and did he speak Italian?
Well, he came here in his family came here. He was born in New York. I'm sure that he spoke some passable Italian. He was born in 99. His family came to New York in 94, 18 that is. And I'm sure that his parents were not super educated, so he probably spoke both English passably, because in New York and going to public schools where he would have learned English, but probably at home Italian was his primary. But once he was here, it was pretty much English, I would imagine, especially to make the press conferences and to look cool and whatever. I'm sure the fact that he was born here gave him a more American accent, so that he could play up to the press. Excuse me.
All right. Olga would like to know, is there any legal business that was built upon the Capone money?
Oh, that I don't know, but they laundered money all the time, and so I'm sure I don't have any. I don't have a track record. I didn't think to look down that road for this purpose, but I'm sure that money laundering then, like now, you had to hide it from the Fed some kind of way. So somebody benefited from it, if only for some of the entertainment houses, whether it's a speakeasy or not. If it's a legitimate nightclub, that's one way to launder the money. And so there was always something like that. I mean, Dale O'Banion worked out of a flower shop across from Holy Name Cathedral on North Michigan Avenue. I mean, these people had their legitimate so-called businesses as fronts for their criminal empires. Just like the house in the hotel, rather, in Cicero, the coffee shop restaurant. I mean, is that a legitimate business? Yeah, but a whole lot of illegitimate stuff transpired there.
Right.
There's always something like that.
All right. And then Carol, the Purple Gang were mobsters from Detroit.
Oh, okay.
So just to close that.
Well, the Midwestern gangs all cooperated. Like we see with the Godfather type movies. You have the big families operating out of New York, and then you have the Chicago contingent. And the Chicago contingent usually controlled the Midwest. So whether that goes to Kansas City, Milwaukee, Detroit, a lot of them are operating under the bigger umbrella of what's happening in Chicago. And so probably because on some occasions when they would go to hide out, they would go to places like that. And so there was at least an alliance, if not a direct lineage between the gangs.
Well, all right. I'm not seeing any more questions here. So
let me share this with people, because I have a couple of things. This one here, when I present in public, I'll show them this. This is the actual from February 14th, 1929. It's the statement of Sergeant Thomas J. Loftus of the 36th District. This was one of the officers that came in to the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So this is his question and answer with the state's attorney at the time. But this one I find is a little funny, and imagine how this would play out today. I think this gets reversed so you can see it backwards, but this is from 1923, the City of Chicago Department of Police letterhead to the Honorable Mayor. This is the reformed Mayor, William Deaver, from Michael Hughes, the Commissioner of the Chicago Police Department. And I'll read this because it's funny. Your Honor, I have discussed your suggestion at length with several precinct captains reference to the purchase of three-wheel motorcycles for patrol duty. Also discussed was the suggestion that the department make an effort to employ a greater percentage of minority citizens, to wit, Italians and Italian Americans. You substitute your own now. The general consensus of opinion from all I talked with was without exception opposed to the idea. Imagine how that would fly today. The department has been very fortunate in being able to recruit in the main Irishmen from overseas and narrow backs, and should stick with success. Nothing I can presently think of would do more to ruin the Chicago Police Department than to implement the use of three-wheel motorcycles and to start hiring Dagos in large numbers. I'm Italian, so I can read that. It was a different world, but in many ways, it's the same world. It's just a question of which names you're plugging into the lines on the page.
All right, and with that, let's say good night. Robert, thank you so much for sharing your research and your stories and your experience. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And thank you at home for joining us once again.